All right, well, I will start with talking about lessons learned during COVID-19, and we'll touch upon three things that successful operational risk teams did right in the beginning of pandemic, and in my view, continue to do right now. And that is priorities and focus. We'll touch upon risks and controls, as well as risks and opportunities, so looking at the upside of risk. So if we start from the beginning, as I mentioned, I run best practice operational risk forums. So we do live polls and share insights very frequently. And that's the view from April's poll, so just at the beginning of the pandemic. And the question was, have operational risk priorities and focus changed due to COVID-19? And you can see that majority, 70%, said yes, while the other 30% said no. And that's quite key for me, this yes versus no, because if we think about it, there was you may remember, or some of you may know, there was a way of teaching children to stop, look, and listen before crossing the road. So it's sort of moment of reflection before you cross the road. And I think in the operational risk space, very similarly, it's a moment of reflection. It's almost a situational awareness. Something big is happening. What do we do with that? And good, successful operational risk teams, in my view, exhibited quick shift in focus. So they had this moment of reflection. They exhibited quick shift in focus to allow them to pause and say, what shall we stop doing? We all have our annual plan, which is composed of some routine, nevertheless necessary activities, like doing annual update of policies, following up on incidents, whether high or low value, doing some assurance review. So some of these activities in the moment of crisis can be stopped so that additional time can be allowed to focus on increased risks and weakened controls and evaluation of opportunities. And I think those successful teams, having had this moment of reflection, quickly rebalanced the priorities of themselves and their own teams. So I think let's have a quick poll, and please vote. So you can see a poll in the screen. Have your priorities and focus changed due to COVID-19? So is it yes, significantly yes, somewhat, or no? And we've got a very geographically diverse audience. So let's see, even through this poll, what will come through. So that is quite interesting. I can see you are voting. So just a few more seconds. I can see you are still voting. Okay, let me end poll and then share the results. So you can see, yes, somewhat, 46%, 46 participants, 62% of you said that yes, the priorities have changed. And then 31% said that they changed quite significantly. And we've got in minority, no. And I think that is good, that priorities have changed, because in my view, again, in the situations like this, which are quite significant, this whole situational awareness and the agility and the speed with which we react, which is the softer side of a more mechanical, what's in the policy, what do we need to do? It's more the emotional and risk intelligence. So if we move on to the risks and controls then, so if we put aside some mundane activities and focus on the risks, because the risk profile throughout the pandemic has been changing for financial services. And you can see, again, this is something that we have reflected upon with the Best Practice Operational Risk Forum. So these are the votes of the participants, and the height of the bar reflects the votes that went into that particular risk. So if we start with, if I'll pick on a few of them, I think they are all almost obvious ones. But if we talk about some, information security and cyber. So regardless of whether controls are weak or strong, the risk itself, inherent risk, has somewhat increased during the pandemic. There is an interesting survey that was done by a company called Barracuda, which looks at the information security and cyber situation. And they mentioned, I've got the results of their survey in front of me, and you can go on their website, it's quite interesting, that 51% of respondents have seen an increase in phishing, 46% had at least one security scare, and 49% expected a data breach to appear. So from the inherent basis, the information security cyber risk has certainly increased during this situation. The second one worth talking about is people risk, which is the whole staff well-being. And I think it is so crucial for all of us as we are working from home. So again, from the UK perspective, Financial Conduct Authority looks at the psychological safety as a component of good corporate culture. And based on the survey of City Mental Health Association, 47% of the City of London employees already pre-pandemic had mental health difficulties. So if we think about that, what does it do to employees with the whole lockdown and working from home? Some statistics from the US, Society for Human Resource Management, 22 to 35% of US employees experience symptoms of depression. So that's during the pandemic. And this whole staff well-being, again, the risk itself is increasing. And there is a crucial role of operational risk practitioners to play in this space. It can be quite tricky because our colleagues in human resources sometimes are quite secretive, and extracting metrics is rather difficult. Nevertheless, again, successful teams are actively involved in management of people risk, which is evaluating its level, working really in partnership with HR, to get clear metrics, to report it, and to get to the actionability point. I think a few more risks I'll pick up on this: third and fourth party resilience. So dependence on our suppliers and providers of third party services. As we in financial services are disrupted, working from home, at the same time, the same applies to suppliers. And I think many organizations found some single point of failure and certainly looked to expand and diversify their supplier base. Let's look at controls. So some risks on the inherent basis have increased. At the same time, if we consider control environment, which also has deteriorated somewhat, in particular in some of the areas. So if we look at simple things like record management, again, we print in the offices, our offices are well equipped to information security, there are shredders. And if we consider what is happening at home, so are we allowing employees to print confidential data? If so, what is their ability and capability to shred or dispose of confidential information? So this whole physical record management is an interesting point, which certainly the organizations have to focus on. Voice recording, so the front office controls, which is the sales, the trading rooms, heavily rely on voice recording because that's the key evidence of how the conversation is being conducted. That's the key evidence that can be extracted if it comes to disputes. Voice recording does not always work if the phone is directed to the home environment. So this is certainly, again, an area where the organization needs to be conscious of what is happening and are we losing the ability to record? And if so, how can it be compensated? For example, by taking a manual note of the key conversation. Needless to say, face-to-face supervision, that's quite interesting, again, for the dealing area where the regulators have been adamant that there needs to be face-to-face supervision. And I think there have been dialogues, extensive dialogues of financial services with the regulators, because obviously we are not having this face-to-face supervision. and it's now happening virtually. And then internet email equipment. So again, the same firm, Barracuda. So another interesting point from their survey. 50% of respondents allowed employees to use personal email devices to conduct business, personal email and personal devices to conduct business. And I honestly hope that the respondents, 50% respondents, were not from financial services, because again, that raises this whole question of what data flow, what information flow is happening across all of the channels, and with increased risk of phishing, of external fraud, with fraudsters using this situation. If that is almost, if you add to that the weaknesses in controls, that really puts us in quite a vulnerable position. So again, if we have been agile and quick in shifting in focus, then we should be able to put non-urgent tasks aside and provide the firm with a view of weakened controls, of increased risks and weakened controls. And you can see the result of the poll. Again, that's Best Practice Operational Risk Forum in April. Is the firm having a central view of weakened controls? And that is quite interesting, because minority, only 40% had a clear yes to that, which is 40% of firms. The operational risk department was instrumental in providing clear and transparent view to the governance committees, to the boards and senior management of where are our weak spots, where have the risk increased and the controls weakened. And how is this view provided? I think there are, let's discuss the view, what, and the role of operational risk. So there are two ways of working with businesses. One is by operational risk department doing almost a top-down review, which is a structured review of key risks and the impact of pandemic on those key risks, then provided to the group senior management, the board, and the relevant committees. And I'm frequently asked, like, how do you, what are these top risks? Where do you get them from? As we know, as operational risk practitioners, our risk and control self-assessment has to be at least on the two levels. One is bottom-up, which is granular. It can be departmental or process. The other one needs to be a top-down assessment, which can be corporate view, it can be entity-specific, it can be business-specific, but there needs to be a top-down risk assessment that extracts key risks of the corporation, legal entity, or business unit, which is then supplemented by the granular assessments. And then it's this top-down view that highlights the key risks that is then assessed against the pandemic. Another way of working with businesses is, again, if we put the non-urgent tasks aside, that gives us a little bit more time to get in touch with end users at the call's face. So business units, support functions, discuss with them what are the changes. Have your processes changed? Has your control environment changed? What are you doing now that you weren't doing before? And therefore collecting almost this view bottom up. And it's quite interesting because another topic that we have been reflecting on is the effectiveness of the operational risk department itself and how working from home makes it more or less effective. So those successful operational risk teams that shifted quickly their priorities found extra time to proactively reach out and talk even more to the first line business units and support functions. And for example, doing these types of conversations, but also having some type of informal interaction. How are you doing? Are you working from home? How is it going? Because we shouldn't underestimate the importance of the informal conversations that operational risk management has with more formal and structured, in a more formal and structured way with business and support functions. So I think let's pause and do another poll and see from this audience, what is the view? Has your control environment changed? And it's yes, and we have a central view of weakened controls. It's yes, but we can't quite get to the central view, or the environment itself has not changed. So I can see you are voting. Excellent. Well, let's leave a few seconds. And I think it is quite key. Again, it's the central role of operational risk, and especially in the times of crisis like this, to step up and not only be visible, but almost have the finger on the pulse and provide these value-added services to senior management. Okay, I think most of you have voted. Let me end and share the results. So let's have a look at the result. And that somewhat corresponds to the poll that I did with the Best Practice Forum, that again, 41% of you, and it's actually quite an interesting split, are saying that there is a control environment has changed and there is a central view of weakened controls, and well done for that. You know, that I think is an excellent result. And I think if the environment has changed, but there is no central view of weakened controls, perhaps it's a point of reflection and consideration of how can you achieve it. Okay, let me stop sharing 1 second. So I think then moving on to the next point, which is opportunities. So with the risks come the opportunities, which is the upside of risk. So this is the positives. Yeah, so is operational risk considering not only the negatives, but the positives? And you can see quite interestingly, again, the minority, 45%, were having a structured approach of considering the positives. And sometimes I think this is our disease of the risk department, which is risk, like a gloomy critic, is focusing on the negatives. And if we think about the language that we use in a day-to-day environment, which is losses, threats, risks, so many of the incidents, many of the words have a negative connotation, and it does need to be balanced with this positive view of opportunities to make, again, a balanced view and to have a sort of a balanced conversation rather than a conversation which is more geared towards the negatives. So if we look at the examples of potential opportunities, and these are the bars, again, reflect what the Best Practice Forum attendees focused on. Customer remote access, products and needs. I think what organizations were planning to do in the next 3 months, 6 months, 2 years suddenly happened in 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So a huge collaboration, which is resulting in enhanced remote access, product and needs capabilities. I think, needless to say, enhanced business continuity solutions, because obviously, from a financial services and in general, from a point of view of the working from home, overall it has worked. And I think where operational risk again can add value is consider what are the costs of the alternative business continuity locations. It's not automatic that those can be switched off, but it's certainly a consideration, which is how much are we paying? Is it still cost effective, or are there some savings opportunity? Supply chain diversity, which is again reliance on third party, flexible remote working, which is what we can allow our employees to do, improved collaboration. So I think this raising of the positives is also very important for the risk department. And I think outside of the pandemic, if I look at the example of what we do on a day-to-day basis. So we conduct risk assessments, and you would all be familiar. This is an impact and likelihood risk assessment, 4x4 or 3x4 grid, where we identify, record the risks on the impact and likelihood, measuring them against impact and likelihood. And these are the use of artificial intelligence for client activity analysis, for example. And I think, you know, while identifying the risks, yes, potentially poor machine conduct, excuse me, software failure, cyber, etc., etc., it's really useful and powerful to supplement that with a mirror view of opportunities, which is virtually a mirror image of looking at, okay, but what does it give us? Speed and efficiency, enhanced quality, availability, cost reduction, so that we can consider how can we reduce the risks, but also how can we enhance the opportunities. And this assessment, in my view, is really underutilized in the operational risk space. It's only the right-hand side, which is the risks, you know, the red, amber, and greens that we are focused on, not the blues, which is the, again, a very balancing picture. So let's have another poll. Let's see what the audience thinks about the risks and opportunities, and whether there is a way of conducting opportunities assessments in a structured manner, or somewhat, or not at all. Because again, in my experience, and it's such an intuitive concept, isn't it? Because it enables us to take balanced decisions, but at the same time, it is underused quite significantly. So it's used quite rarely. So I would be interested to see what comes out of this poll. Okay, a few more seconds. I can see you're voting. All right, let me close this poll and share the results. And again, I think, thank you for joining in the poll. Again, I think it somewhat reflects the previous results that came through the Best Practice Operational Risk Forum. So minority, 37%, evaluate risks and opportunities in a structured manner. And especially as a result of COVID-19, but I hope it's broader than that. And if you are investing in that during COVID, I hope that you will take that momentum and carry on assessing opportunities in the future. And if you are not assessing, or sort of looking at it somewhat, again, I think it's a point of reflection and maybe something that can be built upon. Okay, so a few more concluding slides. I think this is keeping abreast of developments. I think just a couple of thoughts from the industry, which I'm sure you're all following the industry developments. So this is our key tool, which is operational risk loss data collection. And an interesting view from ORX, which is a loss data consortium that has published, it's a public document, you can go on their website, guidelines on what do we do with pandemic. Pandemic is a classic operational risk event. It's an external event, yeah? So one-off costs of working from home, one-off expenses of cleaning, building and security, losses due to failures of trade and transactions, as well as extra resources or consultancy firms that had to be engaged as a result of pandemic. So these costs, if we think about it, are operational risk events, and they have to be logged as operational risk losses. That is the ORX guidance, and again, you know, access their website. That's quite important to follow that through. In reality, what is happening? So you can see the results of the poll of practitioners. So you can see in reality, only 12% are treating them as losses. Some are still considering, which is majority, and the rest is not treating them as losses, because until when can you charge cleaning and building security costs as an operational risk loss? You know, it's not possible to charge it indefinitely. And that's where COVID, I think, is challenging us, because it's an unusual event. At the same time, divergence in operational risk loss data recording would result in spikes in divergence in profiles, operational risk profiles of the firms. So some will have spikes, and some others would record it in the expenses, and their operational risk loss profile will be even. So that is difficult and challenging, especially for firms that use external loss data consortiums, because that would, you know, come across through there. So another thing is briefly to touch upon, the pandemic has resulted in a spike of regulatory documents. So it's just one that I'm presenting here. Basel Committee, Bank for International Settlements, issued a document in April, which basically says all the common sense things, you know, look at infrastructure, IT, third-party providers, cyber, because the regulators are worried that these are the increasing risks. And I think the discussions I'm having with some of the regulators now, the feeling is it's too early to celebrate success. True, we did not have major failures. We didn't have in the press, you know, financial services stopped working due to pandemic. There have been major misconduct events or cyber losses, but because of the rapid transition from work to home environment, there may be areas, especially we talked about increased risks and weakened controls, that may crystallize later. So the regulatory view is it's too early to celebrate success, and they certainly would be coming back, although I think they allowed some breathing space for the financial services at the moment, but absolutely to focus on those areas of weakened controls. And finally, a couple of thoughts on could risk have done better? You know, if we look at ourselves as a discipline and we do the risk assessment, and every, you know, beginning of the year, we think, what are the key risks? What are the top risks in financial services space? And I personally like to use, there are, you know, a myriads of industry benchmarks. One of them, which I particularly like, is the Global Risk Report, which every year, the World Economic Forum every year issues the Global Risk Report. The risk report you can see on the right-hand side presents the chart. Firstly, it's in the same impact and likelihood. It presents risk on the two dimensions of impact and likelihood, which is fantastic for us risk practitioners. And secondly, you can see the key risks, which are high on impact and high on likelihood, which I've listed on the left-hand side because they're a little bit small and difficult to see. They are all, you know, big operational risks, which are very close to our heart, like cyber, data fraud, IT failure, also climate change is coming in, natural disasters. And an interesting thing, of course, is the World Economic Forum had infectious diseases right up there as big impact, but the likelihood was perceived as rare, so it wasn't considered as likely. And Manoj would be talking about scenario analysis, and I think if we self-reflect on ourselves as a risk profession, what could we have done better in this whole impact likelihood, predictive indicators, predictive risk management, to what extent we've got a role to play. So I think in conclusion, I'm conscious of time, so I will pass on in a minute to Manoj. I think in conclusion, from me reflecting on what are the three top things that successful operational risk teams have done and continue to do during this period. It's this situational awareness, this stop, look and listen. So rather than just carrying on exactly what we kept doing, but from home, it's thinking through what is of less priority, what is more priority, and therefore focusing on these key areas of increasing risks and weakened controls, and providing management, organizations, companies with a view, so this clarity. Because if we don't have a view of increased risks or weakened controls, it's quite difficult to take the right decisions. Another one is explicitly considering opportunities, because again, thinking about this whole negative incidence risk losses, how do we inject the positive energy into risk management? Risk management is exciting, especially operational risk is a fantastic, very broad discipline. I think there's not a single discipline with such a breadth of the scope as operational risk management. And to the extent we can inject this positivity so that it excites people rather than making them just focus on the negatives, I think we will do the discipline good. So last, Paul, as we are all moving to working from home and have been working from home for some time now. So if we think, what is the largest single operational risk when working from home? Because, you know, we are now all sitting at our desks. The firms are exactly, you know, considering that they would go with that longer term. So we would, you know, it's not a one-off, it's not a question of 1 week, 1 more month, it's more of a longer term situation. And is the overall profile changing? And if so, is it riskier net, or is it the same, or is it less risky? And if it's riskier, then what is, and it's a single choice. So if you've got this choice, which one do you perceive as the single largest operational risk when working from home? So I can see you are voting, just a few more seconds of reflection. And then I'll share the results. And that's an interesting discussion, because I had a poll again on LinkedIn of, overall, do you think from the operational risk perspective, is the environment riskier when employees are working from home? Or is it the same, or is it less risky? So I think that's something to think about, as well as the view on one single risk. Okay, so let me share the results. So we've got split opinion, but in a way, it's not far off from, again, what I hear from the industry. That resonates with me, this whole people risk and employee well-being, because I think it's all about people and about their emotional engagement with the firm. So if the highest risk is people risk, and we talked about the role of operational risk in working with HR and managing people risk, I think that certainly resonates with me. And then we can see cyber, data, and internal fraud misconduct. So thank you for your views. I think to conclude, we will leave some time for discussion after Manoj's presentation. So we'll talk about what you found interesting. And in particularly, I would like to hear from you, what are your lessons learned that helped you enhance your operational risk practices? And for me to end, please, if you like, you know, what you are seeing, get in touch. I like writing quite a lot on LinkedIn. Again, I've got quite a lot of polls, so I liaise with the industry. So please feel free to send me a note or get in touch on LinkedIn. So with this, let me stop sharing, and Manoj, I'll turn it to yourself.
Okay. Thank you, Helen, for that very informative session. And it's also interesting to see the responses from the audience on those ideas. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take sort of 20-25 minutes and talk about some of the framework related topics. So I've divided my session into 7 lessons, so what are the 7 lessons we can take from COVID-19 in terms of operational risk management. The first one I want to highlight is that I think there is a lot of room for us to improve our operational risk horizon scanning capabilities in organization. And COVID-19 particularly highlighted that, where when there were early days of COVID-19, a lot of people were saying, they were surprised, or they were treating COVID-19 as a black swan event, as if nothing was available on a pandemic type risk before COVID-19 started. And then at Risk Spotlight, we do provide an operational risk horizon scanning service. So we went into that service and we said, okay, was it really a surprise? And we found out that these were the news articles. So I've highlighted the news articles here, which were published in 2018, 2019, which were highlighting a COVID-19 type scenario. And in fact, what has actually happened in reality is much milder than what some of these articles were pointing out could happen. So the first lesson is that this should not definitely come as a surprise. So it'll only be a surprise for organizations who did not have any operational risk horizon scanning capability implemented. So I think that would be one of the lessons learned, is to see how we can improve. And we're starting to see that in organizations where they're starting to set up a dedicated team of 1 or 2 people whose job is just to monitor what's happening outside their organization. Because most of the times, when you're doing risk assessments or when you're doing a scenario analysis, the information which is used in doing those assessments and scenario is all which is available inside the organization. But in order for us to do a complete risk assessment, or in order for us to build a proper, complete scenario, you need to combine what you know about your organization with also what's happening externally. So what are some of the emerging threats? What are some of the emerging risks? And best practices. So I think that sort of is the first lesson definitely we could take, is that we could look at how do we invest into setting up operational risk horizon scanning capability. So at least we have a structured way to monitor what's happening outside our organization, and then bringing relevant information in, so we're not surprised when something happens. The second lesson I wanted to share was COVID-19 is also highlighting flaws in terms of human biases. So normally when we do risk assessments and we collect, let's say, the likelihood and impact from risk owners across the different business unit, we just take those likelihood and impact as they have been presented. And we don't consider that, okay, are those likelihood and impact maybe biased by, and there are 100+ known human biases. If you look on Wikipedia, there's like 100+ human biases which are documented, which can influence what people are telling you in terms of risk. And especially in operational risk, where we do a lot of qualitative risk assessments rather than quantitative risk analysis, there is a lot of opportunity for whatever information we are collecting, and then we are reporting it to the risk committee and the board, that information may be colored by lots of human biases of lots of different people into the organization. And I haven't seen in the operational risk frameworks or processes, there is an explicit coverage on how do we make sure that the results we collect from the risk assessments or the reports which we present to the risk committee and the board, they're not colored by these human biases, so they actually reflect reality. And two sort of biases which are relevant from COVID-19, which organizations may have suffered with, is one is the recency bias. So if you may have had it in your risk register, but whenever it came time to prioritize it, people may have said, oh, it's not happened for the last 100 years. So of course it's not going to happen in the next 12 months. So I don't need to worry about that. So that's one known bias called recency bias, where if something has not happened recently, then we tend to underestimate the likelihood of that. And if something has happened recently, then we will overestimate. So if it's not happened, we will underestimate. And if it has happened recently, then we will overestimate the likelihood and the impact of those risks. And then another bias which may have colored then the risk assessments in some of the organization was the availability bias, where because in the news, they may have always seen pandemics in relation to Asia or Africa, organizations in Europe or North America may not have thought, okay, it's relevant for us. It doesn't happen in our continent, it happens in Asia and Africa, because that's where over the last few years, a lot of articles and things which have happened in those two parts of the world. So it's just ensuring that you also factor in how do you consider human biases when you're collecting all that risk data and when you're reporting risk data to your board and senior management. And then I've highlighted 3 very good books which can help you address those human biases. So there is the Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, which is the best one. So if you only have time to read one of those 3, then I would definitely go for that. And then The Logic of Failure is the other one, where it also talks around how human sort of behaviors may influence how you respond to risk, and which risks you treat as important and which risks you treat as less important. And there's also Super Forecasting, which also highlights that there are some people who are not good at assessing risk, because normally when we send our risk assessments, we don't think about, okay, is this the right person to be doing risk assessment? Because super forecasting highlights that you need to be a certain type of a person in order to do correct risk assessment. Just because you're the risk owner does not mean that you may be the right person to be assessing that particular risk. So in super forecasting, they've identified about 10 or 12 attributes you need to consider, that if you are sending your risk assessments to individuals, then we need to know, okay, are these the right people to be assessing the risk? Because if we then use that information we will collect from the risk assessment, then we need to know whether we can rely on that information or we can't rely on that information. The third lesson I wanted to share was around the risk heat map. So I think this is where Helen also referenced in her session, where risk heat map is a common way in which how risk is presented. And typically, when risk heat map is presented, you have that right-hand side top quadrant where the high likelihood and high impact, that if there are any risks on that, then all the management focus and priority will go towards those risks. And what happens in turn is that other risks in the other areas, and if you see pandemic, like what Helen also highlighted, would be in the high, in this case, yeah, the very high impact, but the likelihood is exceptionally low or very low, that those things then generally get deprioritized because of the way the risk heat map works. So this is the lesson here, is that if risk heat map is the only way you use in your organization to decide which risks will you prioritize and which risks you will not prioritize, then you will most likely miss things like COVID-19, because they will never be in that right top quadrant of the risk heat map. So typically what you want to do is that this is the area on the left top side of the heat map. So if you do use heat map, then it's that area is where what I'm calling those as killer risks. So these are the risks which can kill your organization, which are low likelihood and very high impact, that they also need to be equally prioritized compared to the risks you have on that right-hand side, the right top-hand side, because that's the danger area, that's the killer area for your organization. And what you can do is you can look at those risks collectively. So rather than thinking about the controls of those risks individually, you can think of those risks as a collection and then come up with a set of controls which will help you mitigate a collection of 10, 15 risks which fall into that area. So you don't have to treat them as sort of individual risks and then think about individual controls. And then, at least in UK, as part of the operational resilience guidance which the regulators have published, they're asking organizations from a resilience perspective that if you want to be resilient from an operational perspective, then you need to focus on the high impact. Don't care too much about the likelihood, because you need to make sure that irrespective of whether the likelihood is low or high, your organization needs to be prepared to handle and manage those risks if they were to happen in that part of the risk heat map. So that sort of is the third lesson, is that don't use just risk heat map, to rely, because if you search on Google and LinkedIn, there are lots of articles and content available on the pros and the cons. So it's not, it's like any other tool, right, where it has its own upside, where it's simple, but there is also a lot of downside in terms of using risk heat map. So you need to be aware that if that's what you're using to prioritize risk in your organization, then it may not always lead you in the right direction, that you may miss out some important risks in your priority. The fourth lesson I wanted to highlight was around the systemic risk. So these are the risks where they could happen, in one part of the organization, and then the impacts can be in very different parts of the organization, or like in COVID-19, where it happened in one part of the world and it went and impacted, entire world. So these are good examples of systemic risk, where the way the risk may materialize, the cause, the event, the impact, and the effect those impacts can have is completely unpredictable. You don't know where those impacts would unfold. So what we need to do is we need to identify, what are those systemic risks in our risk register, because you will not, as an organization, be able to handle and effectively manage those systemic risks. Because they're systemic risk, we need to handle it as a collaboration with other groups and other peers within the industry, that a single organization cannot be the best in terms of managing a pandemic risk, because it then relies on what controls have been implemented by other organizations, what controls have been implemented by the government. Because if those controls are ineffective, then a single organization, even though they have invested a lot in pandemic risk-related controls, they will not be effective. Yeah. So that the lesson here is to look at your risk register and see which risks would classify as systemic risk, where the cause event impact could happen in very different parts of your organization, or the cause could actually happen outside your organization, and then it could impact not only your organization, but other financial services firms also within the industry, and see whether you then take those risks and start collaborating with other operational risk practitioners in other organizations, or collaborate with regulators or trade associations or government agencies. And a lot of that work has already happened in cyber, risk, where a lot of firms and regulators have come together and made sure that we are prepared. If there was like a major cyber war, then we are ready for that. But we need to do that not only for that risk, but also any other systemic risk we may have on our risk register. And in these cases, because it's so difficult to analyze the impacts of what may be the impact of these risks, then ultimately you need adequate reserves and insurance, as effective risk treatments around this systemic risk, because they will be so difficult for you to analyze. You may not know which controls do we implement, and you will never have 100% assurance that we have implemented all the controls which are required to manage this particular risk. So the reserves and insurance then would act as your ultimate controls or risk treatments for these type of systemic risks. Another element which COVID has highlighted is the element of complexity. So we are realizing how complex things are when one thing changes here, and then you see the impacts in a lot of places. And this is not generally when we manage operational risk, we don't differentiate a complex risk with non-complex risk. We just treat every risk as the same. So if I have 100 risk in my risk register, every risk is treated the same. So this lesson is about separating the risks in your risk register and identifying which of those risks are complex risks, because complex risks then require a completely different way of thinking, completely different way in which how you will implement your risk related controls for those complex risks. And to facilitate this, the best framework I have found is a framework called Conniving framework, which is a Welsh word by an expert called Dave Snowden. So I looked at what were the different frameworks available. And if you Google Conniving framework on Google, or if you also search on YouTube, there are also lots of videos available on that. And I've used his framework. So his framework doesn't necessarily talk about risk specifically, but his framework talks about simple situations, complicated situations, and complex situation. And I've just sort of tried to translate that into, okay, how would I use that from a risk perspective? So if you had, let's say, 100 risks in your risk register, some of those risks would be simple risk. And simple risks are where the cause and effect chain is very easy to determine and understand by many. So you don't need to be an expert to manage the damage to assets due to fire risk, because there is so many best practices already available, so many lessons learned. Every organization should know how to manage that risk, that risk should never be a top priority or a not effective risk in any organization. So that's an example of a simple risk. Then there are some risks in your risk register which you would classify as complicated risk. So an example here is theft of customer data by cyber criminals, where the cause and effect chain is difficult to determine, and not everybody can determine that. So you require an expert, and which is why when we are assessing cyber risk, we don't ask somebody in the first line to assess the cyber risk, because they may not have the technical capabilities to assess the likelihood or the impact of a cyber risk. We have dedicated cyber experts, in our central team, who then help us assess the cyber risk. So those are examples of risks you would classify as complicated risk if we use the Conniving framework. So again, you can figure out what you need to do. You can assess those risks. You can decide which controls do you put in place, but you will just need an expert. So if you're talking about very complicated money laundering type risk, then you'll need financial crime expert. If you're talking about phishing related risk, then you'll need a phishing expert who can then understand, okay, how does that risk unfold? And they can give you advice on how to manage that particular risk. And then the third category is the complex risk. So this is where for complex risk, and an example here is disruption to process due to a large-scale cyber war between nations. And in this case, the cause and effect chain can vary significantly depending on the context, making it very difficult for even experts to support. So these are so complex risks that even experts will not be able to assess the likelihood and the impact of those risks. Even the experts may not be able to say, okay, I implement these 20 controls, and then that'll be enough for you to manage the risk. And in this case, it requires a higher focus on managing the impacts of those risks, because it'll be just impossible to assess the likelihood of those risks, because nobody understands the actual cause and effect and how they may unfold. That sometimes the cyber war may last for 2 hours and then it'll be done, or the cyber war may last for 2 years and it'll not be done. And then how do you assess the likelihood and the impact for such a diverse set of scenarios? And that's where you need to identify in your risk register. So if you have your 100 risk in your risk register, then probably 30, 40 of those will be simple, another 30, 40 of those will be complicated, and about 15 to 20 risks on your risk register may be complex, and then you need to treat them in a slightly different way. And pandemic would be an example of that complex risk, where you can't just treat it like all the other risks you have in your risk register. So please do look at that conniving framework. There's really good a piece of information there on how do you manage complexity from a business perspective. So the framework doesn't necessarily talk about risk, but of course it's related to managing complexity and uncertainty. So definitely connected to risk. Then in terms of complexity, if we want to learn something with COVID-19, then what you need to do is you need to start training your first line and your second line team members on these concepts of complexity theory, complex adaptive systems, systems thinking, chaos theory, because this is where you will find the ideas on how do you manage. And our world and a lot of our risks, they are not getting easier, right? The world is only getting more complex. The risks are only getting more complex. But it has been surprising, where I go and talk to the operational risk team and say, okay, have you done any training courses for your first line team members or even your second line team members on this topic? And they normally not even aware of those topics, so forget about training. But if we want to manage COVID type risk going forward, if we want to become better, then we will definitely need to, sort of learn about those disciplines and make sure that as an organization, we're ready to deal with those complex business situations when they present themselves in the future. And then I would recommend that you definitely follow Warren Black on LinkedIn. So he's the only expert I've found on LinkedIn who's particularly focused on this, where he's saying that all this RCSA we used to do today of inherent risk assessment, residual risk assessment, all that does not work for complex risk. So you need a completely new way of thinking when you're thinking about a complex risk. And he's actually done a lot of good videos and papers, which he has shared, and he's done a PhD, or research on that particular topic. So if you want to learn more about that, then please follow him on LinkedIn. Okay, then something COVID-19 has also highlighted is if you see the use of the word uncertainty, which has gone up dramatically since COVID-19 started. And uncertainty is already an inherent part of managing risk, because you only call something as a risk if there is an uncertainty around whether it may or may not happen in the future. And if it does happen, then what would be the impact of that risk? So that's why we call something as a risk, because there is an element of uncertainty. We are not sure about some aspect, and the level of uncertainty may be 2%, or the level of uncertainty may be 99%. But still, in a lot of organizations, when I read the operational risk framework or processes, the word uncertainty is not used at all. So we just focus on risks and events, and the word uncertainty is there's not even like a single mention. And that sort of is the key element of how we are managing risk, that if we don't appreciate the element of uncertainty, then what we will try to do is that some senior executives, they're not comfortable with uncertainty. So then they will force the risk team to adopt some crude practices to say, no, you have to give me certainty. You can't tell me the likelihood can be 2% and the likelihood can be 40%. Tell me how much is it? I want one number. You can't give me a range. And that's where then we end up using tools like risk heat map, where one risk can only sit in one box of one likelihood and one impact combination. But in reality, that's not how risk works, because if there was a data breach, the data breach may happen tomorrow, the data breach may happen next week, the data breach may happen next year, or it may not happen in the next 10 years. If the cyber criminals come and steal data, they may steal 2 records, they may steal 200 records, they may steal 2 million records. So that risk may unfold in lots of different likelihood and impact combination, but most organizations then use risk heat map to try and create that false sense of certainty that, oh, this risk is medium and impact is high. So now it'll only appear like that. And that's not how reality works. We need to know that even though, yeah, we may present the risk in one section of the heat map, in reality, it could be all over the heat map. And you don't want to then just focus all your risk management effort based on that one possible combination in which the risk may appear. And then also, yeah, organizations use their top 10 risk reporting because they say, okay, we have so many risks. You just tell me what the top 10 risks are. We'll just focus on that. But again, the real life is uncertain. You know, that maybe the 12th risk may turn out to be the biggest risk or crisis for you in the next 12 months. And that 12th risk was not even then in your top 10 risk reporting. So the lesson here is we want to try and use this opportunity to bring back this idea of uncertainty, because this idea was taken out, and then we just manage risk as if, yeah, oh yeah, if we implement these 6 controls, we can reduce the likelihood from high to low. Right? It doesn't work like that. Yeah, so we want to bring this element of uncertainty, start using that in as part of the methodology, as part of the framework, and then we need to train our senior executives around being more comfortable around uncertainty. And then the last lesson is increased usage of scenario analysis. So this is where a lot of second line teams at the moment do scenario analysis, and where there is always very little involvement of the first line when they do those scenario analysis. And primarily the objective is to do scenario analysis for capital modeling. And the frequency is that sometimes the scenario analysis are done once a year, and some scenarios may only be looked at once every 2 or 3 years. And then also the way the scenarios are developed, they're too complex to be utilized by the first line team. So we've taken a very good tool and then we made it so complicated that first line cannot even use the scenario analysis tool. But if you look at how scenario analysis actually started at Shell as a business tool. It was never meant to be a risk analysis tool. It was a business tool. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that we look at the scenario analysis and try and make it simple so that first line, because we want them to be able to look at these emerging risks, this emerging topic, and prepare their business, because they know that their business is going to grow by 20% or 30% in the next 5 years, or they're going to expand into new markets, and then there will be more risks associated when they expand into those new markets. That if they just do risk assessment of inherent and residual risk, that is not enough. We want to make sure that scenario analysis becomes a business tool, and second line needs to create a more simplified version of scenarios so that first line can do scenarios a lot more regularly. You can't do scenarios just once a year. So every time the business unit is making a big decision, they need to look at what are the 4 or 5 scenarios in how the big decision may unfold. Yeah. So that's the last lesson we're taking here in terms of look at scenario analysis. And then I've highlighted 2 books here, which will show you. So if you're not sure how do we make this simple for our business unit, there are lots of great ideas in those 2 books. And in this case, yeah, if you only had time to read one of them, then I would read the second one, The Art of Strategic Conversation. That's the a more relevant one if you don't have time to read both of those books. Yeah. And then by doing that, we will make sure that first line is also ready for these sort of big events and risks which happen. And then they're not just relying on the second line team, in order to predict and analyze those big risks. So this is where we summarize the 7 lessons. So let me just go through them quickly. So the first one was around improving operational risk horizon scanning in your organization, considering human biases and making sure that's part of your framework and your process. Don't just rely on heat maps to prioritize your risks. Review the app approach to manage systemic risk. Identify and manage complexities, so there are lots of complex things in your organizations, complex processes, complex products, complex third parties, that try and come up with a slightly different approach of how you manage those complex processes and products and third parties. And then teaching senior executives about uncertainties, and then increasing the usage of scenario analysis within your first line. And then I'll be happy to share if you sort of want to drill down into any of these, then please ping a question and then we can take any of these and drill down a little bit more. So while you're summarizing questions, let me just present some of the elements which are coming next from Risk Spotlight. So the next workshop we're going to do is on 21st, 22nd, 23rd. So it's a 3-series workshop. It's basically a course on best practices in assessing operational risks and controls. And if you want to look at, okay, what else can we use in addition to risk heat map to prioritize risk, then that's where, yeah, we're going to cover a lot more ideas, because for me, the risk heat map is a very primitive way of prioritizing risk. There are lots of other better approaches which are available. So it's a free workshop. So if that is something of interest to you and your team members, then please go on to that link and register. And then we can sort of expand and look at the risk assessments practices in a little bit more granular level of details. Then I just want to highlight 2 elements which we provide at Risk Spotlight. So earlier I talked about the operational risk horizon scanning. So this is where we provide one of the leading service for operational risk horizon scanning called the Risk Spotlight portal. So this is where it allows you to monitor, easily identify that, okay, what is happening in the world on external theft and fraud? What's happening in the world on conduct risk? What's happening on internal theft and fraud? That we collect all the data from about around 126 operational risks, and we present that in through the Risk Spotlight portal. So that's where we see a lot of organizations who are setting up their operational risk horizon scanning teams in the second line, that they can utilize a tool like this to easily find out what those topics are, so that they can then inform the different stakeholders about any emerging risk or best practices. And the subscription of that starts at $9.90 for a year for one user, and you can get a 2-month free trial. So some of you are already registered for the free trial, but if you're not, then that's where you can go and get a no obligation 2-month free trial. And then the last slide before I jump into the Q&A, I also want to talk about a Risk Spotlight solution, which is where we've tried to address this challenge Helen also earlier talked about, where we want to embed the management of operational risk into the first line. So that is still one of the biggest challenge organizations are facing, that organizations have invested a lot in defining the operational risk frameworks and risk appetite and processes and bot systems, but still it is very difficult to embed that into the first line in most organizations. And that's where we've tried to address that, but it can't just be addressed through software, right? So we had to come and create like a very different solution, which combines software and best practice frameworks and content and consulting, where that's the problem, we are trying to address that. How do you embed operational risk management into the first line and the day-to-day core business activity? So if that is a challenge for your organization and you've tried lots of ideas and they've not been successful, then please do try us also, and hopefully we can help you out in that aspect. And then I've highlighted here, which are some of the topics you can address with those solutions in terms of your ERM and operational risk management, resilience, business objectives, conduct risk, and third party. Okay, so with that, we are ready for Q&A, Helen. So,
and there are so there have been some comments, questions, and let's address the first one first, which is about the slides. So I think the slides, Manoj, if you want to talk, where would they be available and where can participants find the slides and recording?
Yeah, we will email those to you. So you'll get an email within the next 2 business days. So you'll get the link, so you don't have to go anywhere. You'll get it in your inbox in the next 2 business days.
Okay, and then before addressing questions, I think I've asked the audience on what were their lessons, key lessons learned during the pandemic, because we talked about what we think are key lessons. And the question to the audience is, what are their top lessons? So it's quite interesting. Thank you for sharing. Joanna, for example, is saying that the lesson is we need to think about operational resilience much more as a priority rather than focusing on the recovery. And then I think there are comments on expect the unexpected, about risk register, which is it only makes sense when it is connected and mixed, which I read as aligned, fully aligned with previous RCSA results, loss events, registers, news from media, so that RCSA is sort of a thoughtful process rather than what is the impact and likelihood, let's quickly create a risk register. So I think some interesting tips and lessons from yourselves. and a few more questions and themes. So let's pick on some of them. I mean, one question, Manoj, is how has COVID situation impacted the 3 lines of defense? I mean, the word defense has been dropped. The Institute of Internal Auditors has issued the updated 3 lines, which I'm sure as practitioners we've all read. And how, you know, what are we seeing in reality? And I think from my perspective, you know, 3 lines as a concept, I think what we should be doing in reality is working in collaboration to deliver the maximum success, working, whether you call yourself first, second, third line, you know, it's working in partnership and in collaboration. And where I've certainly seen success is where the second line is not too much on the independent sort of challenge side, but working very much hand in hand with the first line, really helping to identify risks, assess controls, and present a clear view, and hand in hand together. And that collaboration actually has increased during the pandemic. So in terms of what, you know, how has it impacted, the successful teams has certainly took this as an opportunity to reach out even more. So Manoj, what do you think of the concept of the, and I know it's a controversial concept, of the 3 lines, and what is the impact of COVID on it?
Yeah, so I think it's definitely, the priority should be to make sure the right things are being done in the first line, and the second and the third, yeah, is then an extra layer. But if things are not right in the first line, then of course nothing is going to be right, because that's where then all the problems would start. So for me, always a big focus is make sure everything we do, first of all, right in terms of what is happening in the first line. And that's where, like, embedding risk management as part of the decision-making process, which very few organizations do, because what you see in a lot of organizations is the first line, they run their business and then they stop every quarter, they do their RCSA of operational risk, and then they switch back to the business, and then they forget about operational risk completely. And then again, next quarter, they will stop, they will do the RCSA, give the data to the operas team. And that is just not the right approach. I mean, whatever model, whether you have 3 line, 5 line, 10 line, it'll never work. And that's where a lot of work is still needed on how do we make sure these risks, the first line is managing the risk of running the business. And if a lot of it is looking like, or second line is pushing a framework or a particular way of thinking, then that's where there is a lot of pushback around that. So for me, you can take 3 line, 4 line, 5 line, if you don't have things right in the first line, because that's where ideally you want things to be resolved and things to be addressed. And that is still a very weak area, you know, for a lot of organizations.
I think let's address another couple of questions. So from Cecilia, should your operational resilience team be part of your operational risk team? And thank you, Cecilia. That's a very interesting area, because resilience is certainly very topical. It has been very topical. It became even more topical with regulatory documents and with the pandemic coming in. And I think if you read the latest Basel Committee document, which was issued in August, what I particularly like from that document is that resilience is the outcome of operational risks materializing. So there is, we did recently a poll with the Best Practice Operational Risk Forum to see whether the industry is moving towards integration of operational resilience with operational risk, or on the contrary to the siloed approach. Is resilience sort of a siloed team, siloed framework? And I think a positive theme and trend was certainly that there is a great desire from the operational risk practitioners towards the integration and convergence. That again, it's not a separate taxonomy category. Operational resilience is an impact of operational risks materializing. And I think where the teams sit, sometimes they are part of the first line, COO or SMF 24 in the UK. Sometimes they are part of risk team, it's risk and resilience. So that depends structurally. But for me, as long as they work together towards integration of tools, frameworks, and practices, rather than a siloed approach to resilience. Manoj, what is your view?
Yeah, no, agree with that, Helen. Can I take another question then from Prakash, where he talks about, can I share something more on how do we make sure uncertainty we start using that a little bit more with the senior managers. And then one example, Prakash, we can use is, for example, let's say if the organization was making the decision to outsource a particular process, and the objective of that outsourcing is to reduce the cost of operating that process by 20% in the next 3 years. So as part of making that decision, you want to make sure that there are some scenarios which are created, because there are various ways in which that decision may unfold. Maybe you will not get 20% cost saving, maybe you'll only get 10% cost saving if there's a change in the foreign exchange rate, if you are outsourcing that in outside your home country. So the idea of uncertainty is not to say that, oh, we can't do anything, because anything can happen at any time, so we can't do anything. It's just factoring that if anywhere somebody says, oh, this is the decision, if we make this decision in the next 3 years, we'll reduce our cost by 20%, then that's where, and there is no appreciation of uncertainty. Well, how can you be so sure that in 3 years you will be able to save 20%? So as part of that business case, whoever is creating that business case, they need to create at least 2 or 3 scenarios to say, okay, this is what we are aiming for, but this could happen, and these are the risks if they were to materialize in the next 3 years. We will only save 5% instead of 20%, or it'll actually become more expensive. Or in some scenario, you can say that, okay, in this case, we'll actually make a 40% cost savings if these were some of the uncertainties which were to materialize in that near future. So my only point around that uncertainty was, yeah, anytime you see anybody saying, oh, this is what will happen in the future, then you have to make sure that you make them appreciate that they're not God. There are things which can happen, and they need to at least think about it. And people, before they approve those sort of business decisions, they need to make sure that people who are proposing those sort of decisions, they think about that we appreciate the fact that, yeah, just because the business plan says in the next 3 years we'll save 20%, everybody just has to go by that, and there is no challenge and there is no analysis of the variability. So that sort of is one example of how you can make sure that we can start thinking a little bit more about uncertainties with senior managers, because they're the ones who will be proposing these sort of multi-million pound type decisions, and they're the ones who are making those decisions and will be held accountable for those decisions.
And thank you, Manoj. And let me pick up a comment from Raj that COVID has increased the importance of scenario analysis, because firms often focus significant efforts on just day-to-day RCSAs and risk registers. And I think that is, that is a very good comment, because we've got tools, we've got a view of the past, which is losses, the view of the present, which is RCSA, sort of a near horizon, and the view of the future, which is scenarios. And all of these 3 tools need to be used effectively. And I think historically, scenarios were used mostly for risk measurement, which is to generate synthetic data, which is not available at the tail end. So it's virtually collecting SMEs to get to a number. And I think, again, from my perspective, thankfully, that practice is changing. So scenario analysis is used more for risk management, which is understanding, discussing with subject matter experts the extreme but plausible events, not only for the number generation purposes, but also to assess what is the preparedness, to question the controls, to understand if 2 scenarios materialize at the same time. So it's much more of a management time discussion. And I think if we continue bringing risk management type discussions into scenario analysis, then there will be more focus on them. Because if it's just a number, there is less value proposition for the workshop attendees. So I fully agree. And I think all of the 3 tools, which is the losses, the RCSAs, as well as scenarios, have got their distinct value proposition.
I'll take a question from Raj on how can you assess uncertainty effectively. So that's where there are some really good ideas in that book, Super Forecasting. So one example I can share from that book is that if, let's say, somebody in the first line has done a risk assessment and the risk is theft of data breach, or theft of customer data, if that was the risk, and they assess the likelihood of that is, let's say, 20%, and the impact of that is, let's say, 100 million, that then if it's one number, then you know that uncertainty has not been factored in. So the way we can find out that people have factored uncertainty is that they should present it as a range. So if they say that, okay, the likelihood of this risk happening is between 20 and 30%, then we know that, okay, they've factored in uncertainty. But anytime you get one number, then we definitely know uncertainty has not been factored in. So that's one way in which the examples are presented, that always in risk, when you talk about uncertainty, single numbers should always be avoided, because single numbers means you're certain. So anything about risk which may happen in the future, it should always be presented as a range. And then the other example covered in the super forecasting book is then the person who is doing the risk assessment also then capture how confident he is about that likelihood. So if somebody says that the likelihood of the data breach risk happening in the next 12 months is 20 to 30%, ask them about the confidence level. So are they like 90% confident, or are they 10% confidence? Because then that'll tell you how much they know about that particular risk. Because if they're 10% confident, then you don't want to rely too much on their assessment outcomes. But if they're 90% confidence, then you'll rely a lot more on their assessment outcomes. So that's those are the two examples of how we can think about uncertainty in terms of, we are always thinking about range, and then always thinking about asking the person about their confidence level. And that will then tell us whether, what is the level of uncertainty we are talking about on a given risk.
So Manoj, I think a couple of questions on the scenarios and how pandemic is reflected. And I think that's quite interesting, because again, there is a divergence of approaches in the industry, that some have reevaluated the existing scenarios and increased them to reflect the pandemic. Some have added specific pandemic scenarios. So from a scenario analysis perspective, what is your view on scenarios and pandemic?
So scenarios, and again, there is a particular technique, right, in terms of creating the scenarios. So most of the time, the way we create scenarios in operational risk management, it's so far away from the way business thinks about what may happen in the future, that the primary driver of those is mainly around, it's mainly around capital modeling. And that is sort of, yeah, one definite use of scenario analysis. But if you were doing scenario analysis from a business perspective, the way you will build scenario is going to be completely different than how you do it for your capital modeling. And maybe I can just show one example of that. So let me just share my screen to just show you sort of how we can think about these scenarios from a business perspective. So I am already sharing my screen. Okay, so let me then just show one scenario. Okay, so if I just go in and we go to a business service and I go to one of the service. So if I show you the scenario here, so this is where, or for a particular business service, you can model, you can have like a library. So there can be a scenario where you're looking at cyber attack, and there can be a scenario where that service may get disrupted when there is a system upgrade. So generally you will have like a library of scenarios around the different topics. And then if I look at the cyber scenario, so in this case, cyber scenario, what you need to think about is the drivers. So this is where, because what is going to be the driver of that scenario, which will change the severity of that scenario. So in this case, if the cyber attack happens during a peak time of when a service is being used, the severity of the scenario is going to be very high than if the cyber attack happens during off-peak time. If the cyber attacker is a nation state like North Korea, then the sophistication of the cyber attack is going to be very different, and the impact is going to be very different than if there are amateur criminals or gangs, who are targeting your IT system. So you need to look at what are the different drivers of that scenario, and then you combine those drivers to say that, okay, these are the different ways in which a scenario may unfold, where there can be a large-scale cyber attack by a nation state, and then the objective of that would be system disruption. And then you pick which of those drivers then are relevant or will play out in that particular scenario. And then you look at your risks to see whether the controls you have implemented, will you be able to prevent that risk from happening? And if things go down, will you be able to recover on time? And then you can create another scenario to say multiple large-scale cyber attacks, they happen within a short period of time. So there are 2 or 3 large-scale cyber attacks which happen within 24 to 48 hours. And then your severity of that scenario will be very different in that case. So this is the idea from the book, the Art of Strategic Conversation, which I talked about, where the main ingredient around the scenarios is thinking about these scenario drivers and then combining them into the different permutation and combination, and then looking at, okay, whether we will be able to withstand that particular scenario or not.
Thank you, Manoj. And let me pick up another question, probably another just one or two questions, and we have to conclude. I think there's an interesting discussion on the first line, feels overburdened, from Rajini. So how can they be convinced to invest more time for risk management? And I think that is, that is the heart of the matter, isn't it? Which is developing value proposition. And I think for me that is key, because we cannot really embed risk management purely with a regulatory stick. So it's all about value proposition. And I think if we compare, if we draw parallels with credit risk, for example, if we bring a proposal to the governance committee to lend money without assessing the credit worthiness of the client, the governance committee will look in disbelief to say, well, surely we should do a credit risk assessment first. And I think exactly the same for operational risk. How can we do major change initiatives, for example, without doing an operational risk assessment of that change, because it's prone to operational risks? So I think it's sort of creating these value propositions. It's the first line, it's their risks to their objectives, which is what are the risks that can prevent them from achieving their own objectives. So how can we help you identify, assess, mitigate the risks, your risks, which prevent you from achieving your own objectives? So I think some of it is about the language, some of it is about value proposition, and then focusing on what's important to the business, what's really preventing them from achieving the strategy, rather than what fits into our taxonomy. So Manoj, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a big topic, right, Helen? And what we had done was we had organized actually a dedicated session. So I'm just sharing on the YouTube. If you search for integrate operational risk in core business, you'll find there are 3 videos of this session we had done about 7 months ago, where we go, because there are lots of things you need to do. So examples are decision making, that anytime there is any decision being made in the organization, then consideration of risk needs to be part of that. So if you want to embed risk management in the first line, that's an absolute must, that if people are making decisions and not thinking about risk, then it will never be integrated in the first line. Other ideas we talk about is job description. So in the course, I gave example where we took from LinkedIn a job profile of people who were being hired in the first line, and there was absolutely no mention about risk. And if risk is not part of the core job responsibility of the first line people, then of course they're going to always think that it's something extra of what they need to do. But there are a lot of great ideas you'll be able to find in those videos, because at Risk Spotlight, we recognize that that's the biggest pain point in the industry. And over the last 3-4 years, we've done a lot of research to try and bring good ideas into the operational risk discipline. And that sort of is where we shared those ideas in those 3 videos.
And I think, again, the discussion I can see is going on the group chat about the value proposition. So thank you, Suzanne, for commenting that you agree with the value proposition and you had success in linking business objectives and process to risk taxonomy. And the first line needs to be aware that they are doing risk management already. So absolutely, I think it's part of it is language. And again, it's something, because if we remove all our jargon of inherent residual risk, leading, lagging indicators, people naturally, even before the Basel Accord and operational risk, people would naturally care about their people, systems, processes, external environment. So that's something that everyone already does. So we just give them some additional tools to do this more effectively. But at the same time, if they can articulate to us how do they do it without our tools, let's learn from them. So I think it's this whole value proposition is very important.
Absolutely. And I see your host Simon is also in the audience. And of course, he's also very passionate about this topic. And he's also, I think he shared a link also earlier in the chat. about a model he's created with group of practitioners. So definitely worth looking at that model. If you're interested in how do we embed, because a lot of the ideas we need to successfully embed operational risk into first line are very different to what we do today. So there is a lot of unlearning which has to happen first, and then we have to sort of learn those ideas to embed, so that it becomes part of the first line, and then second line can just step away and just act as a challenger role and not necessarily get involved in the day-to-day aspects of risk management.
So I think on this, Manoj, let's thank everyone for their participation. We had an excellent audience, very interactive. We had people from all over the world. I think that's fantastic. And thank you for sharing all your views, because again, we learn, it's a dialogue. We learn from each other. We learn from each other's tips and hints. And I think we thank you very much for your participation.
Yeah, the same here. Yeah, thank you very much here for attending, and I see the participation has also been great, and hopefully I'll look forward to seeing you again in the October workshop, when we're going to drill down a little bit more into how do we assess those risks and controls, and particularly how do we do that from a first line perspective, not from a second line perspective. So hopefully I'll see most of you in that workshop in October. Okay, so thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.